Okay, good morning. Ayin Beis, volume 3. We are on page 1341. So let's review what we learned. So the overall theme was Yud Gimel Midas Harachamim that God revealed to Moshe Rabbeinu, to Moses on the mountain, with a focus on the words the Aver Kvedi, the Samticha, the Nikres Hatzur. God placed Moshe in the crevice of the rock, in the womb of the rock, in the cavity of the rock, and that's through that he revealed to him the Yud Gimel Midas Harachamim. So from that we know that there's the revelation of the Yud Gimel Midas Harachamim, and there's the source of it is the Gvuras of Atik. That's the level of the rock, and the crevice from the rock, Gvuras of Atik, which manifests in Moiches Tamah, in the superconscious mind, which in turn is the source for the 13 attributes. This is also the level of the Rishimu, which is ultimately rooted in the Helema Atzmi. So we learned that there's two levels, therefore, in this revelation. There's the Yud Gimel Midas Harachmim themselves, which he can compare to the sweetening of the Gvuras, of the severities, but not from within, but from without. So it's like the second level of the sweetening of the Gvuras. He said that explicitly on page 1339. And then there's the source of it, and that relates more to the Aved of Tzadikim. The Tzadikim also have a level of Tshuva Ma'ava, but it's more the divine soul is radiating with such power that essentially completely neutralizes or nullifies the bitter waters of the Gvuras. Whereas in the first level of sweetening, it doesn't completely nullify it, it neutralizes it in the sense it overpowers it because there's more sweet than there is bitter. Here we're talking about transforming, but the transformation is coming from the Yud Gimel Midas Harachamim. And then there's a higher level, he said, Sur, that's not just that the light replaces the darkness, but the actual darkness from within gets transformed. That's the call of distress that comes from the animal soul. The difference being between Se'ir and Dvash, the two substances, the two items that were not supposed to be brought into the Beis HaMikdash, because they're both as offerings, Le'saktiru, Kol Se'ir, Kol Dvash Le'saktiru, because these are the two levels of Gvura. One is a Gvura of diminishment, the sour dough, and the second is a Gvura from abundance, too much intensity, too sweet, which can also hurt and destroy. The difference between them is that one is Tagberis, the second is Tagberis HaChayes, like the intensity that we learned about, and the other is coming from the diminished element. Another difference between is that the first one, the abundance, is not a real chet. That's like Ben Zema, who wanted, his intention was to serve God, but it was misplaced. So he was overwhelmed. The same thing with the children of Aaron and the other examples that he gave. So therefore, even though it ended up being not a good conclusion, but it's coming from Avedus Hashem, from a high level, right? Sad Haribui. And that's called Din de Gadlus. Then Din de Katnus, on page 1340, I'm looking at right now, is the din that comes through actual sin, Sa'ir. That's a diminishment, where the Shekhinah actually gets concealed, not an overabundance of Gilui, but the opposite, a diminishment of it. And that leads to Gvuris, to the Gvuris, the second level of Gvura, which is much more the darkness of diminishment and concealment. And there the tshuva is not the tshuva from Ava, from the divine soul, but there's a tshuva coming from the bottom up. Like he said, there's actual kas and siluk, because there it affects the midas and the malchus of Atzilus. So there it's coming from descent, but that descent is not a real Giroin Amiti, because that anger and rage is actually coming because of an intensity. However, it manifests in the negative, and that's why through tshuva you draw down something that's even higher than the Yud Gimel Midas Harachmim, which is the first level, like Dvash, honey. And then to explain that, we learned on 1340, and now going into 1341, that there's two reasons, and you can say two levels of Rachmanus, Rachamim. One comes from a very logical and rational place that you see someone who's in need. You see a person who's in need, and therefore you feel compassion for that individual. And that's a rachamim that comes, but you're more or less commensurate. You see someone, and you relate to them, and you empathize with them. Then that's a rachamim. The second is mitzad hareimamus. Not because you empathize with them because you're on their level, but on the contrary, you're actually beyond them, completely beyond them. But reimamus, greatness and exaltedness, is drawn and has compassion simply out of its greatness. Like he explained, the Teva Amrumel is nimshach el hashafel, that the Rachmei HaMelech is so intense that it goes down also to the lowest level. And the reason that the Rachmanis is not only on the Shofar, also on the Gavaya, meaning also on the ministers and people who are closer to the level, is because the king is beyond everything. Everyone is compared to him like a Shofar, meaning like a low level, because he's an equalizer. And therefore he extends that compassion to, like he said, that compassion is also extended to a minister, just like to a servant. What is this lamaila? Lamaila is the difference between rachamim of seder ishtalshlus. That's the rachamim, that's most likely not Yud Gimel Midas HaRachamim. That's the rachamim within the structure, like Tiferes of Atzilus is rachamim, not necessarily Yud Gimel Midas HaRachamim. Yud Gimel Midas HaRachamim, as we learned, is in Keser. It originates from the Cyrus, the hairs, which are like the wires, the thin wires from Weichis Tamar, from Gvuras of Atik. But rachamim of seder ishtalshlus, that is a rachim like the first level, something commensurate. Rachmanis within ishtalshlus, godliness, so to speak, relating to existence, has rachmanis. That's level number one, like he calls it. I'll just read it inside to have the exact language here. Rachmim to seder ishtalshlus, mitzad yediyah v'hergish. Just to give a little more elaboration on it, you may recall we learned there's the yodeya and yodua. That sometimes we refer to God as he knows, sometimes we say it's known to him. The difference is obvious in the language. When you say he knows, it means that he's among us, so to speak. It's like he's seeing it the way we see it, from within. It's like where it says by Sdoim, the Hashem says, let us descend, I will descend to hear the cry from Sdoim. So Chassidus asks the question, what's Erdana? Where does God have to descend from? He doesn't hear the cry from heaven? Because there, at the whole Arichas, there talks in the Alter Rebbe and Tere'er, the famous Maimer in Vayera, where he discusses on Erdana the whole idea of Atzilus, that Hashem manifests himself in the spheres, so he's actually descending and seeing it from within. So that's like Yodeya. That's like Rachamim in Ishtalshlus. Yodua is that it's known to him, he sees it from above, like Das Elyon, from the perspective of Kalaman, from the perspective above. So that's just an example. So that is the first level. And that's the level of Harachamon, our Father, the compassionate one. He's among us and he's compassionate to us like a father to children. But then there's of Harachamim. And of Harachamim is not the Slapshus. The first one is Slapshus Pnimi, Leido Lahargish Kol Nivra V'Nivra B'Shgacha Pratis. I'm reading from the bottom of 1340. And there, he's like manifesting within and seeing it all as it is from in a Ephraim Primi. Then there is Machem Tzadar Reimamus, that's a Rachim that's higher than Stalshlus. That's HaYesh Yachad Lavad, HaMevins Kol Masem, as he's seeing it, B'Skira Achas, like one picture from above, like a bird's eye view. So there's also compassion from there. And the contrary, it's a compassion that's higher than the cosmic order, than the structure. But this is Rachman al-Elmis Kumay al-Elmis Tachteni, because they're all equally distant from him, like we said before, that the Shafla and the Gavaya, the lowly one and the higher one, are all equal to him. Of Arachmim, that's on Musaf of Shabbos, Keser, Rotzen, higher than Islapshus, right? And in general, that's the difference between the Gili of the Kav. So the Kav is actually called the Kav is the way it's within the Nimsha be'elmas la'acharat simsum, there Rachamim mitzad ha'hergesh, Slapshus Primi, and Erein Sof before that simsum is the Rotzen HaPoshut, which is above the structure, and there And there it's Rachamim higher, and for sure the level of Ein Sof that's higher than Alei Sarotzen, as we learned. We're still going to get back to those levels in a few minutes. Okay. And that's just Rachamim Kol Shishtalshus Dakab Mereish Kol Dag Not Seif Kol Dag. Very good. Okay. Now he introduces a third level of Rachamim. That's completely beyond. And to explain that, he says, Omnam be'emes, and this we learned as well, this is the last share we had, last class. Also the Rachamim Mitzad HaReimamus, the second level, also has some hergish. To say it's completely aloof and removed, no, the king, it's still his subject. It's his empire. He's not a king on a different nation. He's a king on this nation. So even a merumam, yeshlem eze shayches, yeshlem mekom mokem eze shayches el hamerumam. And that's why he's merachem alav, and that's why he's compassionate over them. Yeah. So there's some shayches. And the same thing above, what is this the level? The level of Sevav Kalam. So even though Mamala Kalaman is the divine that's within existence, as we've learned, and I explained, Sevav Kalam is the transcendent divine beyond, but it's still called Sevav Kalaman. So it has some shaykhs, it still surrounds the worlds. It's still, well, surround is not the right word, as the Alter Rebbe saying, but it still relates to, so it has some Eza Hergish. He brought the example from Ninveh, okay, that even though it's Sevav, it's still Ksas Hergish, even though it's an equalizer, Adam Behema. Yeah. And by Kriya Samsuf, like we said, that he bemoans the fact, Maisi Yodik Tevim, it's God's creations. So he's relating to his creations. So even though it's from above, meaning like the Rachamonis of Reimamus, but it still has some relationship. And what is that above, before the Tzimtzum? He says that's the Rosh Hashanah that still has a relationship, because we said before the Tzimtzum, you also have levels of Ohr. You have the Ohr that reveals the Galis Lezulase as he's envisioning and relating to, like the person who's envisioning a house. So even though he didn't build a house yet, but he's already relating to it. And Vashir Atzme B'Koyach, and allocates resources toward it. Okay, so like he says, even in Malchus, the Malchus are Metzias and Nevraim Tefes Mokim, and there's something commensurate, even though it's quite distant, but there's some relationship. The same thing in Malchus of Ein Sof B'Chinas Alei Sarotzen, even though it's Merumah Mamuvdal Mishtalshus Makomok Mishtalshus Tefes Mokim Sham, because God's relating to it. And even the level above that, when we talked about Gili La'atzmei, Gam Mashal L'mayla B'Chinas Alei Sarotzen, even before it arose in his desire, there's still some form of Gilead, like we learned. We learned to himself, but there's some revelation. So even though the revelation is still to himself, but to say it's completely removed, no. So now comes level 3. What's level 3? And he calls now Hamelach HaKodesh. Shekodesh Mitzatza Atzmei Ein Klal B'Chinas Gilei B'Chinas Hamshacha B'Atzmusei. Melech Yochid. That is completely Yochid u'meyuchid Eined Milvade Shalei Yashum Mitzias Klal u'b'Meila B'Chinas HaRemus Ein Hashem Merum Alei Zedavar. So this level of Remus is not that he's exalted over something. In level 2, he's exalted and everything equalizes everything, but he's still exalted to some extent. You relate him to that he's a Melech Ala Am. Here, but in other words, it's his essential state of being something completely beyond, a different, unique Metzias, a unique entity. I don't want to use the word entity or Metzias, to be honest, but let's call it something, a unique reality. So Im Kain, b'madrei. So now that he's completely removed, there's no Rachmanis because he relates to existence. In level number 2, there's something there. It's his king, it's his kingdom, it's his subjects, it's his people. Here, the kolzeh is only with even the shuffle. It's true, he's a shuffle and everyone is equal compared to this king. But he's still an entity. He's b'mitzias. Just read the last lines from where we left off. The remus ha'atzmi, this third level, this core essential remus that's not even relating to anything. There's nothing but God, has no relationship to any other, including the worlds at all. And this is the level when we say, we're asking God, only for one reason you should come have compassion, because you have much rachamim. Not because we're your people, not because we're your children, not even of rachamim, but simply because rachamecha harabim rachem aleinu, but rachamecha atzmim dafke. The rachamim that comes, this atzmis dikarachamim, simply because God can have compassion. There's not because of a relationship, not for sure, not level one where He relates to us like among us. Level two is still some hergish, like he said, some feeling, some connection. Here, there's no connection. It doesn't have to be a father or a king or anything. It's just b'rachamecha atzmim dafke. I know we read, I think, a few more lines, but I'm going to start from here again because we read a little quickly, maybe, but it's always good to review. So this is the third level. Now, I'm sure you're right away trying to guess. So which level is which in regard to what we discussed earlier? Like in other words, what is sur? What is yudgim sarachamim? And are these the three levels of sweetening? So most likely the answer is yes. But as always, I would like to wait and defer to see how the Rebbe Rashab concludes the subject matter. But because it seems so glaringly obvious that these are probably the three levels. The Rachmim V'Seder Shtalshus is most likely the waters, the sweet water that sweetens the first level of sweetening, which is like where there is a battle and the Nefesh Alakis wins over the Nefesh Abamis, what he called the Tzadik Shein Gomer, or even the Beinani. Then there's the level of transformation, Yud Gimel Midas Harachmim of Tzadikim, Gemurim, but it's coming from the divine soul. And then there's the level of the real Baal Tshuva that comes from the darkness itself, from within the darkness. It's most likely these are the three that we're talking about here. But again, I'd rather wait till we literally finish the subject, and we'll see if the Rebbe Rashab says it explicitly, or we can whether it's implied and so on, whether we can derive it from there. So let's continue with this discussion. And I have much more to say, obviously. Once we know now that it's Mamala Kalam, Masevu Kalam, and Atzmus, or Atzmus Ein Sof, it also, as we'll discuss more at length, connects a lot of themes from earlier parts of Ayin Beis, especially in Volume 1, when he spoke about these three levels, in the Sfiris and in Keser. So the interface is really based on these three. The divine within existence, if you remember the Ayin of the Yesh HaNivra, there's the divine above existence, the Ayin of the Yesh HaMiti, and all the way to the highest level of the Etzem that unites and joins the two of Das Elyon and Das Tacht. So you have the three. You have the perspective from within, the perspective from above, and then there's the level that joins them both. But obviously you can't reach the third level if you don't go first through the first two levels, which is all the Aveda of Mutfe, Murgish, Muskel, climbing the ladder as we refine ourselves and expand our containers to be able to receive higher levels of the divine, all the way to these highest levels. But that's what we'll talk about that a lot more soon. Let me just continue reading from here. But in case, since we didn't have a class a few days, if anybody wants to ask anything up till now, and then, as I said, it's not finished, the subject of this Rachamim that he's talking about, Rachamim Atzmim. So I'll be happy to take any questions, if there are any.
I had a very small question. When he's describing this highest level of...
What's the question?
Well, when he says this highest level, I'm wondering why he says Ein Elokim, because if this is the highest level, basically Atzmus, we learned that Elokim is basically is godliness that manifests itself, in Biyah.
Okay, I hear your question. First of all, Elokim can refer to many levels. Elokim should never always just be suggested that. We're going to see in a moment, he's going to talk about Elokim as Beire, Elokim, but the Boira, the creator itself. So just because Elokim is used in some places as godliness within existence, not necessarily everywhere. That's number one. Number two, even here, we're not talking about Atzmus. He's talking about Atzmus Ein Sof, higher than Oir. So just for accuracy, I wouldn't necessarily use the word Atzmus on this. In the high, if you mean the highest level of Atzmus, because the word he uses is either Atzmus Ha'Ohr or Helema Atzmi. That's going to be ultimately the level he's going to be referring to. Yeah. Miboldecha Ein Elokim is actually a pasuk, and we say it in Davening. Mibolde Ein Elokim can also refer to that besides him, there's no God, meaning there's nothing else but him. It's another way of saying nothing else but him. Additional. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. So Al-Zeonim of okay. So the last line I read here now, and that's what we request. But Achamecha harabim rachem eleim. Good. So now let us continue from there. So I'm on page 1341. The line begins with Achamecha atzmim dafke. I'm going to start va'inyan hu. Okay. So I believe we read this, but we'll read it again. Va'inyan hu. The inyan of this is commotion is bar leil, as was explained earlier. And we are Dibra Maschal Anila Daidi in volume 1, page 135. They cite below. Bepirish Elekei Elam Berachamecha. So Elekei Elam, what is Elekei Elam referring to? So he's going to explain Elekei Elam could be, as you just suggested, a lower level. But here he's going to say, no. Elekei Elam, the Elekei Elam kumay beira Elam. Elekei Elam means, we're not talking about Shem Elokim as it's usually used, but it's like as if we say beira Elam, the creator of existence, the creator of the world. Elekei Elam, the God of the world, as in the creator. The Shaykh Alav Rak Shem Beira. There's no other name you can give him but saying Elekei Elam. Now, I know it's confusing because you'd say, one second, you just said he has no connection to Elam. So it's like saying the creator of existence, but not to focus on existence, to focus on being a creator. So at the end of the day, we're calling God Beira Elam. Because we do exist, but we're referring to God as no other name. We can call him only Beira, because nothing else can create but God, the creator. So if you go back to Anila Deidi in volume 1, and actually I have it in front of me, let me just look to refresh my memory. 135, yeah. Kuf Lamed Hey, let me look it up. I want to see if I can derive something. I think, if I recall correctly, yeah. We say in the morning in Baruch Shamar, we say, Yetzer, Elekei Elam B'Rachamecha Arabim Rachem Elenu Adenu Zenu. Yeah, now I remember. So he explained that the levels of Baruch Shamar can be explained on many levels. Baruch Shamar V'Hoya Elam can be talked about God as he relates to existence, but there in the Maimer Nila Deidi, there's a long discussion. I remember now, I'm looking at it. Yeah, he spoke about it on two levels, but on the higher level, he was talking about everything before the Tzimtzum, all the different levels that we say. I recall there were 5 levels that he explained. Let me just see. Yeah. He actually is referring to Atzmus, built to Mitzias Nimtza, Mitzias Atzmuse. So that's how high of level he went there. Yeah. Sur Mizgavenu, Mogin Yeshenu, Mizgiv Badenu, right. Adenu Zenu. He went through all the expressions and explained how they are all before the Tzimtzum as it comes down into Seder Shtalshlus. So it's definitely worth looking at, but I don't need to quote more than that because he quotes enough here that's relevant. So there he did interpret Elekei Elam on the highest level. When you say Boira, who can create? Only Atzmus can create. All the levels below Beira cannot create something new. They can be part of the instruments of creation. So we're saying Elikei Elam, we're talking about the Beira. And therefore, when it says Elikei Elam b'rachamecha harabim, we're referring to Rachamecha harabim that's coming from this level, what is called Atzmus Ein Sof, the Shaychel of Rak Shem Beira. There's no other name that you can use for it except say Creator. And that means Elikei Elam like Beira Elam. U'b'rachamecha harabim, and that's the continuation. We're invoking and reaching up to Elikei Elam, to Beira Elam, to Atzmus Ein Sof, and we're saying, "B'rachamecha harabim, in your great compassions, hu b'chinas Etzem Ha'Ohr shelamayla gam b'chinas gilui la'atzmei." This is referring to the Etzem Ha'Ohr. Now remember, as I explained, he kept going Etzem Ha'Ohr, which is higher than any gilui, even to la'atzmei. It's the Etzem Ha'Ohr, the source of Ha'Ohr. But then we go even deeper to Hela Ma'atzmi. So if you recall, I'll just refresh your memory. If you remember, I explained what's the difference between them. Why does he keep saying Etzem Ha'Ohr then Hela Ma'atzmi? Etzem Ha'Ohr sounds like Oyer, and Hela Ma'atzmi is Helam, is concealment. So I explained because ultimately they both come from one God. And therefore the Etzem of Elokus manifests in Oyer, that's called Etzem Ha'Ohr, higher than Gili. And then there's the Etzem Ha'Ohr as it manifests in Hela Ma'atzmi, that's beyond any revelation. So on the highest levels, they really are both coming from one place, and then they will ultimately become two tracks. But where they meet is the Etzem Ha'Ohr and the Hela Ma'atzmi are both essentially coming from Atzmus, the power to radiate, to illuminate, which only adds to the ultimate fusion and integration between the two, because at the end of the day, we want to have the Hela Ma'atzmi to be Begili, and the Gili should reveal the Etzem. We want a combination of Etzem and Gili. And that's ultimately where all this comes together. But right now, we're still talking about it in these levels.
You just said Atzmos, and you meant Atzmos Ein Sof at this point, or Atzmos, this last time you mentioned.
Which level? Tell me, what level you're asking about? Elikei Elam? Here, Elikei Elam, he calls it Atzmus Ein Sof. In the back in that mimer, he says it originates from Atzmus, that is referring to Beira Elam as Bilti Metzias Nimtza. Is there a difference to you?
The difference all along.
I mean, everything comes from Atzmus.
I mean, I don't understand anything. I don't understand even the Sia, but is there a difference to me? I just want to know for my own geographic record.
Well, Atzmus is the source of everything, that we know. The question is how it manifests. So clearly he's speaking here about Atzmus Ein Sof. He just called it Etzem Ha'Ohr. Shalamayla gam b'chinas gilui la'atzmei. She can't call it Atzmus. Even though in the Maimer that in Anila Deidi, he does refer to Elikei Elam as Atzmus Mamish. So my answer would be from Atzmus Mamish comes Etzem Ha'Ohr, which is what is Rachamecha harabim u'b'chinas Etzem Ha'Ohr. Remember, Rachamecha harabim is not the level, nothing is the level of Atzmus except Atzmus. Rachamecha harabim is already, we're invoking and saying, Elikei Elam, you Atzmus, that's completely removed from everything. From there, please have compassion on us. Rachamecha harabim rachem eleinu. So Rachamecha harabim, he calls here clearly Etzem Ha'Ohr, that's higher than Gilui la'atzmei. Now, Gilui la'atzmei, he said before, was like the level of, he didn't say it explicitly, but like the level of Ratzon HaPasha, that's higher than the Rachmim of Seder Shtalshus. Or I should correct myself. There's the Rachmim of Seder Shtalshus, then there's Etzem HaPasha, Ratzon HaPasha, and even Gilui la'atzmei would be the Ratzon of, like Sevav Kalama, right? That is Merumam. And now we're talking about the third level, the higher level, Etzem Ha'Ohr. Okay. It's higher than Gilui la'atzmei.
Yeah,
but they
just said they meet at Gilui Helen comes from a higher place.
You want the mechanics of it? You want to understand it?
No, I'm never going to understand it.
The geography,
I'm never going to understand it, but
or you want to understand it. If you want to understand it, I can explain. The geography is not my thing. You're going to have to go to a tour guide for that. If you want the understanding of it is all comes down to, are we talking about the divine as it relates to existence? Are we talking about the divine that relates but is above and transcends existence? Or are we talking about the divine on his own? Those are the three levels. That I can explain fully. That's the difference between Mamala Kalaman, what he said, the Rachamim in the Shtalshlus, like in the Spheres. Then there's the Rachamim that still has a relationship, but it's beyond and above, transcends, like Sevav Kalaman, but it still has some connection. And then there's something beyond any connection, which is what we're talking about now. Now, you want to know where it fits in the map? Atzmus, complete Atzmus, Mitzusim, Atzmuse, built in Mitzias Nimtza is usually not what is discussed in Chassidus, unless it's explicit. In the Maimer and Anila Doidi, there he wants to say it originates from there. That part of Atzmus manifests in Barachamecha Harabim. Barachamecha Harabim itself is a manifestation. What he's calling now Etzem Ha'Ohr. He says clearly it's Etzem Ha'Ohr that's higher than the Gili La'atzmai. So we're talking about these three levels. Go ahead. Anybody wants to ask anything on that? You were both
just to Tzvi. I mean, I'm. It's a good question. When he says be'etzem ha'or, it's because barachmecha harabim is, like you said, a manifestation. It's some kind of gilui. So it seems like we're asking for God to manifest something, and it has to be a revelation. So that is on this track of gilui, which is etzem ha'or, as opposed to helam ha'atzmi. So it seems like this is the highest level.
Hold on. First of all, Etzem Ha'Ohr is not a gili. Etzem Ha'Ohr, as we said, is beyond gili. It's just the etzem.
But it's the source of gili, isn't it?
Yeah, but why are we going there? I just mentioned it just for the context. But the point is, it's not gili la'atzme. There's no revelation yet. As I explained, it's the power. The Etzem Ha'Ohr, like we learned earlier, is Atzmus's power that ultimately, yes, it will be the source of Ohr. Correct. That's correct. But at this point, it's not a gili. So
I just meant it's the shorish. That's all.
I don't want to say the word shirish because the Rebbe Rashab doesn't say the word shirish, but it's not even a mocker lemocker. But you could say it's away from Atzmus when he's going to manifest and say, I want to reveal, express something. Etzem Ha'Ohr is the first step toward that direction.
That's all I was trying to say.
Okay, that's what I was saying.
No, the only reason I brought up the question and the subject is that you all other times in the shir you mentioned Atzmus and so for Hulu, and this time you just mentioned Atzmus. So I just wanted you to clarify.
It's because if you look in the Maimer Anila Deidi, the Rebbe Rashab mentions it. That's why I mentioned it. When he said the Elokei Elam, Beira Elam, he mentioned Atzmus, Mitzisim Atzmusei, built in Mitzis. That's the only reason I mentioned. I read from there. So I was very precise. I was bringing it from the actual language. If you go in volume 1, on page 175, he says that very explicitly. Not 170, 135, sorry, 135. That's why I mentioned it. But if it's confusing matters, he's not mentioning it here. Here he mentions Etzem Ha'Ohr, so let's stick to that. Yeah. On page 135, chapter 72. If you want to look it up in volume 1. Okay. Let me make it clear again. The reason we don't talk about Atzmus is because we cannot have a relationship with Atzmus. Atzmus is beyond anything. It's a built-in Mitzias Nimtza, means you can't even call it exists. We exist. Existence and the non-existential state of God's beyond existence don't have anything in common. For us to have a relationship, we have to have something in common. That's why God created a Seder Shtalshlus. You tell me how many times have I said this? Maybe, I would say probably 500 times in my classes, at least. The whole purpose of Shtalshlus is in order for us to have a relationship in a way that makes sense to us. That God, Kol Yachol, who can do anything, to create existence and says, I'll have a relationship with existence on my terms, there's no purpose in that. Dir b'tachtenim means that there's tachtenim, there's an existence like ours with all our structures and infrastructures, and we have to slowly climb the ladder. Every one of us is born a newborn, and you don't become an adult overnight. It grows, mutva, murgish, muskel, and it's easy to get tempted and seduced by atzmus because it's very great to think about it, but it's not about you. Atzmus is not you. That's you. That's atzmus. Now, atzmus in his compassion, if I may use that expression, gave us the tools and instruments to climb a ladder and go step by step and have a relationship, not just with his giluyim, not just with mamala kalam as the divine relates to existence, and not just with sevu kalam, the transcendent that is beyond existence, but even with the highest levels, that's beyond, and that's all these levels that we learn about. Gilei lezulas, gilei la'atzmei, etzem ha'ohr, helam ha'atzmi, and even higher than that. So when you think of it from the logic of it, you understand from that it's not just about talking about atzmus. It's ultimately how are we going to relate to it. And we can only relate to it through the terms and through the tools and containers that we have. Now, God implanted in those containers all the abilities that we're discussing here. The work coming from outside the darkness, within the darkness. So bottom line is that's the real underlying theme. Does it all originate from Atzmus? Obviously. There's only one God, and everything originates. But this Atzmus, so to speak, now has given us a whole structure and infrastructure to relate to him. And each level relates in a different way. Giluyim, Oyer, reveals to us certain aspects. Helam reveals to us other aspects. Together, they reveal even more, as we discussed. As we get to know God, so to speak, we get to know him through all his actions and through all his creations. So now we're talking about this highest level of Rachamecha Rabim, Etzem Ha'Ohr, and now he explains, Vuhu, and this means, Vuhu, Shekol HaMakifim Nishachim Imenu. All the Makifim come from this Etzem Ha'Ohr, Shezeh Inyan Yud Gimel Midas Harachim. So now he's talking about Yud Gimel Sarachim clearly on the highest level here, that all the Makifim come from this level of Rachamecha Harabim. So even though Rachamecha Harabim is above it all, but it means from Rachamecha Racham Aleinu, from Rachamecha Harabim, Racham Aleinu, have compassion upon us from this highest level where all the Makifim come from. Now what he means by Yud Gimel Sarachim, we'll see shortly. Let me read it inside and we'll see, is he referring to different levels of Yud Gimel Sarachim, or is he saying that ultimately the 13 attributes of compassion that we're familiar with, that was level 2, is that originating from Rachamecha Harabim level 3? So I'm not positive yet. Let's read inside. Let's see. Now this is the Rachamim that's coming from Remes Ha'atzmis, Shemerumim Be'etzem. This is Merumim Be'etzem. We're not talking about the king of the nation. That is also fundamentally removed from them, but there's still something, some commonality. Here we're talking about Merumim Be'etzem, Etzem Ha'Ohr, the level of Etzem Ha'Ohr. So that's what means Etzem. In other words, in Ohr itself, it's not Ohr that's already relating to something, expressing itself even to yourself. It's still an expression of himself. Like, for example, we spoke about, and I go back to the examples. What's the difference in Etzem Ha'Ohr, and Gilei Lezulase? Let me explain. So remember, we spoke about that a person is born with innate desire to have a home. Ein modem beloy bias. Ein modem beloy karka. A person is not complete without a home. But obviously, a newborn child or even a 10-year-old is not really thinking about a home, is not missing anything. They live in a home. So it's going to take years for them to even awaken within them that desire, I want to have a home. And then it can take another bunch of years until they actually apply themselves to say, okay, what kind of home I want. And then even more time till you build a home. So we can have innate, essential connection to a home and not be aware of it for who knows how long. So the Gilui Lezulase is when you're already beginning to express it to another, to your spouse, to an architect. You're putting it down on paper, you're writing a plan, or at least you're envisioning a plan. The level before that is this Gilui La'atzmei. You're not talking to anyone about it. You are now aware, I want to have a home. But it could take time. And we learned about this at length. And then there's beyond that is what was innately inside you that you weren't even aware of. You didn't even think about it. A newborn child has it. So Lamaila Kavyachol, so to speak, for God to want it to make sense to us, that we can relate to these levels, Hashem said, I too am manifesting myself in these levels. And I'm giving you ability to understand how I work. And how do I work? First, there's a level that's completely beyond. That's like Etzem Ha'Ohr. The truth is, there's a level beyond that too, which is Atzmus, or we're going to speak about Helam Atzmi. But Etzem Ha'Ohr, at least there's something there, but it's an Etzem. It's completely on a level of Etzem. Like he says, Merumim be'etzem. It's not even revealing him to himself. He's not even, there's no expression even to himself, meaning there's no revelation at all. Then there's expression to himself. Then there's expression to another or relating to another. These are the three levels he's talking about here. So he says it's etzem merumim be'etzem, b'chinas etzem ha'ohr. Why is it called ohr then? Because it is an entity. There's something there, but it's not in any state of revelation. Well, the mailam is there, and this goes back to what we discussed. Even higher than that is the hela b'chinas hela ma'atzmi. So we have both etzem ha'ohr, and it's even higher hela ma'atzmi, which is even higher than etzem ha'ohr. Etzem ha'ohr is not revealed in any way or expressed, but it's still something that you could say is going to be expressed. Hela ma'atzmi will never be expressed. It's going to only reflect what the etzem of atzmus that's beyond any form of expression. The only place it does get revealed is actually in Helam Lamata, as we're learning. In the Cheshach below, the darkness below reveals the Helam Ha'atzmi. That's the twist here. The tshuva that comes from the distress from the darkness, as we'll soon learn, as we have learned. So that's Helam Ha'atzmi. I believe this is where we stopped actually last year, but it was worthwhile reading again. I'm going to read the parentheses now. And I figured out, I think the parentheses ends in 3 lines after the words that would be my guess. So it goes for 3 lines and then he continues. That's what it looks like to me. And if I'm wrong, but it's most likely that. So here's the parentheses. So he says this level, the Ein Sof, this is the level of Atzmus of Ein Sof, Shemashpil Atzmei Kavyochel, Lisker as Pchinas Reishis Hagilui, that lowers himself, so to speak, to remember the Reishis Hagilui, Shubchinas Hagilui la'atzmei v'Hagilui shelitzerech ha'elemis. So he's now referring to an expression we say in Rosh Hashanah. I'll explain. Let me read the whole thing here. Shezein zikaron liyem rishon. So what do we say? Zeh yem tchilas masecha zikaron liyem rishon. Today is the beginning of your creation, we say in Rosh Hashanah, about Rosh Hashanah and Rosh Hashanah. And the Zikaron, a memory, liyem rishon. So the question is, it's redundant. You just said, Zeh yem tchilas masecha. Why is it a memory? What are you remembering? This is the day of the beginning of your creation. So Chassidus explained many different ways. One explanation is what he's saying here, that the level of atzmus that's beyond Zikaron, beyond revelation, beyond any expression. So on Rosh Hashanah, we're saying, Zikaron liyem rishon, please God, the God that is beyond any expression, remember the Gilui la'atzmei and then the Gilui l'zulosei, or l'tzerech ha'elemis. Who inyan zechrein the Rosh Hashanah, and that's the zechreinis. We say Rosh Hashanah when we say Malchus zechreinis shefris. So we say Malchus is the kingship of God. Zechreinis is that God should remember. What is he remembering? And does God need to be reminded? He doesn't know. So memory is an awareness. It's like saying to your father, remember me. Of course your father knows who you are. Of course your father loves you fundamentally in the deepest way, deepest compassion. But sometimes it's not revealed. What we're doing on Rosh Hashanah is invoking, please express it. Express it by recreating the world and accepting us and being king over us. So the fundamental essence, like I said before, God has Etzem Ha'Ohr, there is the connection that he wants to have a home, a Dira B'Tachtenim, or Malchus, but it's not any form of revelation. It's completely removed from everything. What we want is Kavyochel, that should come down a level. Firstly, to remember to be conscious in his own self, like he says, Gilui la'atzmei, and then the next level is to think about it in relation to us, to existence, And that's the zechrenes that we invoke on Rosh Hashanah. So here clearly he's saying the Etzem Ha'Ohr, even though he says it after the words Hela Ma'atzmi, so you could say both the Etzem Ha'Ohr and Hela Ma'atzmi are both being drawn from to come into a Gilui La'atzmi or Gilui L'Zlose. I would say it's talking about the Etzem Ha'Ohr because the Hela Ma'atzmi doesn't come into Gilui La'atzmi really. So even though he says it after those words, but you could explain it in different ways. I'm not going to go into it right now. Let's just suffice to say it's three levels in general. The level that's beyond any Gili, the level of Gili La'atzme, and the level of Gili L'Tzerech Ha'elemus. And that is all what we invoke on Rosh Hashanah. That's why it's a parenthesis, because it's only explaining the idea. And that's what we say, B'rachamecha Rabim Rachem Aleinu. May it come from that higher level, which I should add is a key point here, because we don't just want God's relationship with us only as he relates to us. We want his etzem to manifest in his relationship with us. In other words, you could say, okay, God's completely removed from us, and we're asking him, throw us some crumbs, give us something. And he gives us something from a level called Gilei L'Tzerech Ha'elemus. The question is it drawn from the source? And the answer is absolutely. We want the source that's beyond it all to manifest in something that relates to us. That's the key thing to remember here. That's the bridge. That's the bridge between the Etzem Ha'Ohr, Hela Ma'atzmi, as it comes to the Gilui La'atzmi, into the Tzerech Ha'elemus. And all this is still before the Tzimtzum, and the same thing repeats itself after the Tzimtzum. Okay. Yeah. I'll read two more lines, at least. Now, how do we draw this down? How do we do this? If it's so beyond, how do we do it? So it says, "V'amshochazu hi Bittul HaYesh dafke." And the amshach is through our Bittul HaYesh. If we remain locked in our own sense of self and self-awareness and self-consciousness and self-interest, obviously we're not open and we're not going to open up these higher levels. So what's the process, how to access these levels? It says it's Bittul HaYesh. And this too is on Rosh Hashanah. Shezeh Inyan, that's why I'm saying the parentheses, because it seems to me both parentheses are about Rosh Hashanah, and that's outside of the actual text. It's the parenthetical elements. So what's about Meva Shefer? Because he says, what does he say in the Gemara? It says that you should say, Omru lefanai, Malchis Kadesha Tamnechuni Alech, Malchis Echrena Shefris. So he says, Ubameh Bashefer. That first is you say Malchis Kadesha Tamnechuni Alechem, and Zechrenis Kadesh that Shei Zekarin Lifnechem, that God should remember us. And how? Bameh Bashefer. The idea Shefer shall ayel, the Shefer of a ram. Dafke. Chinas behema, ayidezeh hu dafka zikaron. So the zikaron that God is remembering, meaning from his higher level that's beyond revelation, is now coming into a state of zikaron, remembering. That is dafke when we take a shefer of an ayel, which is the symbolism of Bittul HaYesh, the behema within us. As he's going to explain, the animal soul, the yesh, is being elevated and sublimated. And that is what Shefer does. Shefer is the symbol of Bittul HaYesh, taking the ram's horn, the behemoth, the Bittul HaYesh, and that's what draws down to Zikaron. In other words, without Bittul HaYesh, you can't reach this higher level. You can reach through Nefesh HaLekis, you can reach high levels, but you can't reach the level that's all the way to Etzem Ha'Ohr, and especially the Hela Ma'atzmi. I would read on, but I think we should, I'll reserve that for the next class. Because he's still going to explain further what this Bittul HaYesh is, and he's going to bring it back to tshuva from the animal soul, the distress call that ultimately reaches this highest level all the way to the Hela Ma'atzmi. Now, just for the record, I said it a number of times, but here, if you go back to the difference between, that's the second, let me just refer you. If you go back to page 1267, yeah. 1267. So you look there, the difference between Eris and Kalim. So he says like this. When you say Ein Sof, it's on Ohr, not on Atzmus. The Ohr comes from Ohr, so it goes like this.
Are you above Afhine or below Afhine?
Below. So he says these words. Just want to see the exact language here. Yeah. Sherish bechinas kelim den etzolim is atzmus mohus ein sof. V'sherish amokar ha'eresh bechinas ein sof bilvad. He referred to it also before on page 1336. Eresh are from hispastus of ein sof, and kelim is from atzmus ein sof. So you see from that we're talking, both of them are not atzmus. They're both coming from two tracks, but the kelim come from more of a higher level that's higher than revelation, like we discussed earlier at length. So this is a theme we've talked about several times, just to distinguish between what we call Ohr Ein Sof, or Hispastus of Ein Sof, and Atzmus of Ein Sof. Just giving a little more language in context of what we just learned about these different levels. Okay, I'm going to stop here all the way at the bottom, 3 lines from the bottom of page 1341. The floor is yours if anybody wants to ask anything.
When we make this appeal to God on Rosh Hashanah to remember, we're appealing to Etzem Ha'Ohr that he should please reveal himself into Gilui La'atzmo, and then later even lower the Gilui Olamos. Is that how are we reaching up there, or so? Because it says here, Rashis, we say Zachor. When we say Zachor, we say Rashis Gilui. So who be hit as Gilui La'atzmai. So my question is, are we even reaching higher than that when the appeal is to Etzem Ha'Ohr, which is before Gilui, or to the level of Gilui itself? Gilui La'atzmai.
It looks like Etzem Ha'Ohr. Atzmus the Ein Sof. The language he uses here for who b'chinas Atzmus the Ein Sof shemashpil atzmei, that Atzmus Ein Sof should lower himself kavyachol to remember b'chinas reishis hagilui, so b'chinas hagilui la'atzmei and hagilui l'tzedek elemis. In other words, when we say zikaron liyom rishon, remember the reishis hagilui of yom rishon when you first created existence. So first came the revelation to yourself, and then the revelation. So it's the 3 levels. We're invoking something higher than the reishis hagilui to remember the reishis hagilui, which consists of the of 2 levels of gilui. That's how I would explain it. Now, to be exact, we always invoke God himself. So we're talking about we're invoking Atzmus, but we're invoking Atzmus as he manifests what he calls here Etzem Ha'Ohr, and also Helam Ha'atzmi. I can't ignore that. He did mention that here. So he doesn't explicitly say which level, but it's definitely going all the way to the source. But you want it to come basically from Atzmus into Etzem, into Helam Ha'atzmi, into Etzem Ha'Ohr, into then the Zikaron of Gilui La'atzmi and Gilui L'Zulasi. That's how I would actually accurately express it, because you don't want to come away with the impression that we're not talking to God, we're talking to Etzem Ha'Ohr. At the end of the day, we're talking to the Atzmus, but Elov V'Leila Midesav, to God himself. But what we're talking about is that God should manifest himself in the process of remembering and creating existence. So it's not just you're crying out to God, period. It is to draw down that energy into existence, into the creation. That's why he's using the words Etzem Ha'Ohr and on all these levels, just to clarify the exact point here.
I was wondering, sorry, Eliezer, were you done? I guess he was done. He like you were saying, he threw in L'mayla Mizeh b'chinas Helam Ha'atzmi, and what we're asking for is a manifestation, a revelation, if you will, of Rachamim. So it's kind of like he snuck in Helam Ha'atzmi. Now I recognize we just went through multiple pages about where the Yud Gimel Midas HaRachamim come from, the Bittul Kardanusa, and that ultimately is rooted in the Helam Ha'atzmi, and because of the Gvuras, that you need this Tagvuras Atzmius in order to draw down that level of compassion. So I'm not saying it's unrelated. He just explained to us how it is related. But in this context of us appealing to God a revelation, for a manifestation of Rachamim, it seems like that's a track of Gilui. It's kind of like he snuck in Helam Atzmi there. Now, maybe he's
I wouldn't use the
probably will
word
explain.
snuck in at all, because when we finish this subject, you'll understand it. When we finish this paragraph, next page, hopefully tomorrow, you'll see he brings it all together. It's all related. So the answer is going to come the explanation is going to come very shortly.
Okay.
Because the question is, how do you access it? Like you just said, Bittul HaYesh. What does Bittul HaYesh have to do with Etzem Ha'Ohr? Why can't you just invoke it through the tzaddikim? So clearly, we're going to need to have something from below that needs to reach all the way into the Helam Ha'atzmi. So you'll soon see how it works.
Okay.
Ask a better question.
Yeah.
Are we talking about Yud Gimel Midas HaRachamim, the second level or the third level? Remember, we're talking here now the third level. So we have to understand, why is he bringing the third level in the first place? So remember, so it's not finished yet. We'll get there.
Yeah, and when I say snuck it in, I meant it felt like that to me, not like he doesn't know what he's talking about, or he's not being logical.
Not only that, it's if he didn't mention it, would be bigger problems, as you'll see shortly. But remember, this goes back a while back when he first spoke about the root of the Rishimu. He already said, Etzem Ha'Ohr l'maylam is Helam Ha'atzmi. This expression is used at least 3 times, if not 4, that I recall. So it's a very common expression. This whole section, Ayin Beis. Keep that in mind.
Okay.
Is Rabbi Jacobson, is Ayin Beis expanding the concept of what we consider Hishtalshalis, Seder Hishtalshalis? Traditionally, I always thought Seder Hishtalshalis begins with the Tzimtzum Rishon, but here aren't we saying, doesn't it look like the Hishtalshalis is really beginning from Atzmos to Etzem Ha'Ohr and Helam Ha'atzmi, and then lower to Gilui La'atzmo, and then Gilui La'olam, Gilui outside. What was the term? Gilui La'olamos, and all the way down. It seems like that the Rebbe is establishing a Hishtalshalis that goes all the way up, as you said, like climbing the ladder. This ladder goes all the way up to Atzmos.
Okay, so I have addressed this topic a few times, and the point is like this. Firstly, it's not just an Ayin Beis, it's in general Chassidus. So a few points. Number one, microcosm, macrocosm. Whatever exists in Seder Hishtalshalis, in the literal Hishtalshalis that begins after the Tzimtzum, and you're accurate in that, we don't talk about Hishtalshalis before the Tzimtzum, is rooted in before the Tzimtzum. What Chassidus Chabad comes to be Machadish is that whatever you have after the Tzimtzum, you can find a microcosm, or macrocosm, I should say, before the Tzimtzum, because God said, I want even before the Tzimtzum, these levels, the source of all these levels. So when we talk about Hishtalshalis, we're talking about the source of Seder Hishtalshalis. That Lefiyerech, when you talk about relatively speaking, I don't know if you remember, I read a letter from the Rebbe here at length, how the Rebbe speaks, someone asked the Rebbe, how could you say there are levels before the Tzimtzum? That's really the question. And he says, there's no real levels. It's only relative. And it's essentially like saying, where is the artist, before he creates the art on the canvas, he envisioned in his mind the art he's going to create. Is that Hishtalshalis or not Hishtalshalis? So technically it's not, because it's all in his mind. But you can say in his mind, relative to the levels that are higher than him envisioning the art, that is called the source of Hishtalshalis. So that's the general way to look at it. And it is ultimately helping us to understand that we could connect to the divine that pre-Tzimtzum. Remember the question he asked in Ayin Beis earlier in volume 2 was, can a post-Tzimtzum reality, a post-Tzimtzum consciousness relate to a pre-Tzimtzum reality? And the answer is ultimately yes, because of what we're learning now. Besides that, the whole Tzimtzum is in order to bring that, is also because the levels before the Tzimtzum are also helping us understand how God's mind, if you wish, works, even pre-Tzimtzum. So technically, Hishtalshalis begins after the Tzimtzum. That's correct. But the source of it, so to speak, it's again, so to speak, because it's so subtle. As I said, most of us can't even wrap our head around a Siyah Ruchnius, let alone Atzilus, let alone Atzilus the Klolos before the Tzimtzum. That's why I always say that it's all technical until you really understand the level in Avodah here. Because right now we're talking about levels that we, as I said, if we were able to even take our yesh and just spiritualize it a bit, that's Asiyah Ruchnius, long lower than the Tzimtzum, below the Tzimtzum. And here we're talking about levels before the Tzimtzum. But the Rebbe Rashab is giving us a overview and a panorama of the whole picture. And this is the way it's working within so-called the Godhead, in the divine before the Tzimtzum, all relative and all very subtle forms. Like we talk about Esser Spheres Sagnuzis. Is the 10 hidden spheres are before the Tzimtzum, but they actually manifest after the Tzimtzum. So can you call the 10 hidden spheres Ishtalshlos or not? The answer is you can't call them Ishtalshlos, but you can say it's the root of the root of the root, ultimately, of what will become the Ishtalshlos of the spheres. That's the general approach to it.
Thank you. That clarified beautifully. A question is, what's the technical term that is applied in Chassidus to this level? Is it called Shorish Tzimtzum, Makor Tzimtzum? Is there a term used to discuss Lifnei Tzimtzum, but within God's head,
Sometimes it depends which level. If you're talking about the lower level, sometimes it's called Shorish Shoshe, the root of the root. Sometimes he says it's not even called the root of the root or the mucker of the mucker, but it originates. So there's different ways you can explain it. It's really more the understanding of it, not so much its name. At the end of the day, it's rooted there, but not as a root like a seed and a tree, because there's no seed there at all. It's all within the divine powers, so to speak. So really, you have to find the best way to understand it is when trying to understand our faculties. How would you define, if I have the power to throw a stone, the power to throw the stone, how is that power residing within my soul? Within my hand, I have such strength and power. We know that faculty, that's koyach hagoli. Then there's a koyach hanelim, koyches hanelomim. And then there's koyches hayulim. And there's koyches atzmim. Then there's the koyches haklulim benefesh. And then there's nefesh nesekeiches, and there's the etzem nefesh. So use the example from yourself of how something comes from the most dormant and most amorphous state within your soul, and how that manifests in a koyach. And you'll begin to see how complicated it is to relate to it, because it's so far apart. You know, when you see a newborn child, for example, forget about a newborn. When you see one cell, a newborn has been conceived, one cell. Could you imagine that cell will become a full-blown adult like you and I, with all the faculties, thank God, that we have, et cetera, et cetera? You can't even imagine. And that's still a physical cell. Now, if you think about how is that cell envisioned by God before the neshama even comes to this world, before the body is even the cell was not yet conceived. There was no seed and there was no egg and nothing was fertilized. You see, when you start abstracting like that, you start realizing. So there's no question in Ruchnius, there is a source for the neshama and the guf that will ultimately become conceived at the point of conception and then develop and split again until it becomes a full-blown adult. But you see, from that's the way we have to try to think this through, because you're going literally from the bottom up, from a physical reality and relating it all the way how it is in God's mind, and not just God's mind in Asiya and Yetzirah and Bria and Atzilus, and in Kudim and in Ak, and the Kav, but all the way before the Tzimtzum. You see what we're talking about here? Well, how many levels you have to begin to relate to? That's why that's the only way to really realize the scope of this. It's quite awesome and quite vast. We barely can understand what's going on in our own bodies, let alone our souls, let alone in the cosmos, in the universe. And then we're talking about these higher spiritual levels. And yet Chassidus does give us a picture, and step by step, we try to understand how it's working there. So I don't have a real name. Sometimes, as I said, source of the source, root of the root. Sometimes Mocker, sometimes Sherish is higher. Sometimes it's not, it's called not Gam Loi B'Bchinas Mocker, we have used the expression. You can't even call it a source. You could just say it comes from there, but you can't identify, like Yesh Ma'ayin. Is the ayin a Mocker for the Yesh? Or is it like an invisible source? See, there's sources like, a bottle of water gives you a cup of water. That's clearly identifiable. Sometimes you can't identify the source. If you recall, we had the 4 relationships. Etzem Ispashtus, Kayach and Poel, Gili and Helam, Yesh Ma'ayin, Hiyuli and Gili, in the beginning of volume 2. So there's a lot of different ways to talk about source, the source, and the sourcee. I don't know the right word. The creator and the creation, or the source and the thing that comes from the source, the cause and the effect. There are many, many different names. Anyway.
Beautiful. Was that recorded? Your last statement now? Was this recorded? Great.
Yeah. Yeah, it's pretty fundamental, and these are like the axioms, or I guess the what's the word I want to use? These are like the axioms, the principles.
The lexicon?
Principles. These are the principles that are necessary to understanding Chassidus that you don't always see in a mimer. What I just said now is like between the lines that I wish they taught it to us when we were in yeshiva, but you have to figure it out on your own. But this is essentially the underlying theme of all of Chassidus. Yeah. So we will stop here. Let me stop here. I'll stop the recording at this point, bottom of 1340.